Today, the machinery of control. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics for the latest posts covering finance and prop news with a distinctively Australian flavour and with a little philosophy on the side. And I'm joined today by Brian Martin, Emeritus Professor of Social Sciences at the University of Wollongong. And he's the author of more than 20 books and hundreds of articles on dissent, non-violent action, scientific controversies and other topics. His latest is called Official Channels and it came out just this year. Hi Brian, thanks very much for spending some time with us.
Hello.
I've read your book and I have to say I thought it was absolutely brilliant because what you're really doing is highlighting some of the dynamics below the surface and you know, I'm very interested in that from a philosophical perspective.
The book is, I've told about this a bit. It's something that I found hard to do because of the sort of, official channels aren't all bad, but there's all these problems.
Yeah, and I was going to say, the issue is we know that there are some who do it right and some who do it well. And you haven't in the book rubbished everybody, right? But what you've said is there are a whole bunch of things that potentially can go wrong and quite often go wrong. And you give real case studies and real examples where they have gone wrong. So learn from those case studies, I guess, is what I read from the book.
Great. I'm very pleased that you liked it.
But maybe a good place to start is whistleblowers. What are they and why aren't they very successful?
Okay, good questions. Now, the standard definition, whistleblower is someone who speaks out in the public interest. And typically, they're an employee and they see something wrong. It could be fraud, could be dangerous to the public. And so, naturally, going to someone who's conscientious, concerned about the organization, going to report this to the boss. There's a problem here, boss. And unfortunately, if the boss is implicated in some way, and it could be either by being involved in some corrupt dealings, or it could be simply because they've tolerated it. And then it's often, oops, this person is a danger to us, not a team player, and various reprisals start. And it's just unfortunate because the person doing the right thing is the one who then suffers the consequences.
Right, and sometimes they could be dismissed or, legal action might follow and all those sorts of things. And whilst there are meant to be some protections for whistleblowers, it's probably true to say that, and you say it in the book, in fact, that those in command see whistleblowers as traitors. That's
right. And I started actually coming across this thing about the official channels don't work even when I first started studying dissent. And but even then, it didn't really hit me in the face when I became president of Whistleblowers Australia in 1996. It's a long time ago. And I just heard from, whistleblowers that they're usually ringing up on the phone in those days. And the stories were so predictable is that they spoke out about something, and it could be in a church, in the police, in the military, public servants, schools, just all sorts of different occupations, but the same scenario, which is they spoke out, they suffered reprisals, and then what do? They're going to go, I'm going to seek justice somewhere up there. And up there means probably initially higher management, never works. And then they start going externally to so-called watchdog agencies. And the surprising thing is how seldom those worked. Now, of course, the ones who are contacting us in Whistleblowers Australia, not likely to be the ones who had satisfaction. They're the ones who had a problem and still needed someone to help. But nonetheless, it was quite startling.
And you talk about the backfire model as a way of thinking about this, and I found that also very intriguing.
Yes, well, this is from studies of nonviolent action. So you've got the situation where you've got protesters out there, and then the police do something really terrible. So like in Dili, East Timor, 1991, the troops were surrounding this funeral march, and then they just opened fire, killing hundreds of people. And so this was a case where there were Western media present, and the thing leaked out and actually turned the tide, for the East Timorese independence struggle. I realized that's a sort of backfire for the Indonesians. They attack, and they thought they're going to, subjugate the people, but actually it turned out to be counterproductive. But here's the strange thing is then I started looking around thinking, yes, that occurs in a few occasions, but there are many more where the attacks don't backfire. And why is that? So then I started examining the sort of things that perpetrators, those, let's say the police or the military in this case, could do. For example, they cover up what they've done, they hide it, and they devalue the target. They reinterpret what they're doing in terms by lying or reframing, and they use official channels. They set up some inquiry which looks like it's providing justice but doesn't. And then the final method is intimidation. And I found those same methods used in a whole range of things, ranging from sexual harassment to genocide. It's quite remarkable. And official channels is the surprising one.
And so we'll hold a royal commission, for example. It is
That's right.
One such reaction to when there's an issue, right? And of course, we saw that with the bushfires, and we've now seen it with COVID-19. And I guess the question is, those official inquiries on the surface look as though they will actually, think about an issue and expose it. But often the processes are designed really, perhaps through the terms of reference and perhaps through the way that they're actually managed, to basically not really get to the heart of the issue quite often.
That's right. And in terms of the Banking Royal Commission, the government was afraid that they'd be forced to have one imposed, and so they raced in. The banks actually wanted them to set it up so that the terms of reference could be limited. And even when you got a good Royal Commission, the commissioners are on the spot and they're getting really good material, and in many cases nothing happens. You've got the Royal Commission, you've got the recommendations, but they aren't followed up, or just followed up in a superficial way. That's like the deaths in custody, Indigenous deaths in custody. Lots of good recommendations, but no follow-up.
And presumably, while the Royal Commission is running, people then say, well, I can't comment on that because there's a Royal Commission looking at it. So it gives them an out so that they can effectively step back and not engage around the issue.
That's right. Exactly.
So you can see how the process works. And, one of the thoughts I had there was that clearly there are whistleblower protections and there are guidelines for the way that commissions should run, but it's all down to whether it's executed effectively and appropriately, or whether, does the legislation effectively become useless simply because of the way this is actually run?
Well, this is the strange thing we found in Whistleblowers Australia, because whistleblower laws were introduced in the 1990s in most states and territories, and yet we knew about lots of cases of reprisals against whistleblowers, but the laws were never implemented against the employers. Employers are supposed to be subject to the law, and if they take reprisals against a whistleblower, they should be penalized, but almost never happens. So it's one of these things that it looks good on paper, but we warn people, don't rely on the protection.
Right. So there's a difference between theory and practice, and what is said and what actually happens, right? In other words, there's another set of rules that are sitting below the ones that are on the surface, and people may superficially assume that X is happening, in fact, Y is happening. That's the fundamental disconnect, isn't it, you're talking about?
That's right. It's symbolic politics.
And another example of that are elections, right? Because in a way, you could almost argue that on one level, the election process is the great opportunity for citizens to participate in the decision-making process. But many politicians, it seems to me, and you made the point in the book too, see elections as effectively the only objective in town.
That's right. I mean, if you look back at the history of democracy, go back to the ancient Greeks, they didn't think elections were things were like, we're going to elect the commander of the army. And they really used either the full assembly, of course, it's only male citizens, I mean, it's limited in its own way, but also they use random selection, like we use today on juries, for most important choices. And it has a lot of advantages, but it's somewhere along the line, random selection, which was seen as more democratic, was turned around, and electing representatives was seen as somehow better. And you're exactly right. Elections, they promise a lot. People put all their trust in them. And then, I don't know, the number of people I've seen disappointed by the outcome is too many to count.
Right. So the question is, what they say before the elections and what they actually do after the elections are often different, right? And we've seen that in spades in recent times. And I guess the question then is that, does democracy effectively get exposed as a bit of a sham because of it?
Well, I don't even call it democracy, because that's, call it representative government,
right?
Which is certainly better than dictatorial government, but it's far short of actually citizen participation in decision making.
Yeah. Right. So effectively, again, processes below the processes that quite often aren't actually fully understood. Now, one of the other things that you've picked apart, and this is close to home because of the financial services nature of this channel, is you use the example of the recent financial services regulators, particularly ASIC and APRA, and some of the tricks that are actually thrown into the mix there to effectively deflect from really addressing the critical issues that should be addressed.
Yes, well, what I did in the book is I first told about the things I knew about the most, such as, well, in particularly whistleblowing, but also sexual harassment and plagiarism and so forth. But then I've been reading a whole bunch of things in all sorts of different areas. I thought, official channels here, official channels there. And of course, Adele Ferguson's book, Banking Bad, just read it through and think, oh my gosh, and all these techniques that were used. It's unbelievable. And you'd know all of this much better than me.
Well, you actually listed out, and it's worth just going through them because I think it's a brilliant list, right? So, firstly, the regulator seeks appointment of a tame, regulator head, so they can control that, right? They denounce effective regulators. They investigate the journalists. They often take no action. They delay. They make false promises. They don't release criticisms of regulators. They go easy on, the parties that are identified. They collaborate with the institutions being regulated. They impose inadequate penalties, and they use revolving doors to keep people coming and going, so that effectively the regulators are less effective than they could be. I mean, it's a shocking list, but it's so true.
Yes. The difficult part in writing about official channels is I don't want to say that they never work or that you shouldn't have them.
Yeah.
But when you see the cases of the tame regulators, the ones that are actually serving the industry that they're supposed to be looking out, controlling, if you like, making sure they do the right thing, it seems like they're worse than nothing because they give the appearance of protection, of justice, without the substance. But the other thing that I did is not to say throw out all regulations and they're all tame cats and so forth, but to say we need to look at alternatives and put more energy into those. And the two that I emphasize most, one is developing people's skills. So instead of having all this whistleblower protection, or not instead, but in addition, how about, let's say, management gives every employee an information sheet provided by an outside body that's concerned about, how to speak out effectively. But they're never going to do that. I've never heard of any employer who's done that. But so it's very hard. And then the issue of changing the culture. So that's even bigger. It's a long-term project.
And I want to just touch on that a bit more because I was going to say, it seems to me you are really coming to a set of cultural norms, right? And a set of behaviours that are wired into the way that people do things and wired into the way that, for example, government behaves and corporates behaves. Is your sense that Australia is more or worse than other countries in terms of this sort of these processes? I mean, is this a global issue, or is there something specific about the way Australia works?
It's a very good question, and I'll give you the easy answer, which is I don't think anyone knows.
Fair enough.
Because I don't know of any comparative research on the levels of corruption in different countries. We often say that, Transparency International ranks all the countries in the world and so forth. But if you go into any organization and you do an in-depth investigation, you'll find all sorts of shady things going on. Mm. And so how can you possibly compare one country against another when you can't even get to the bottom of one organization? And so all I can say is that a lot of people think Australia is relatively, well off, relatively honest internationally. But when I talk to whistleblowers who've been in the sort of big time, they become totally cynical and think the whole place is totally corrupt. And who am I to judge? Because I can't do the comparison, but they're definitely big problems, but there's a lot of people trying to do the right thing as well.
Yeah, no, and I understand the difficulty because a lot of it's submerged and a lot of it is going to be, a little bit, it depends. But I guess your 2 points about inside organizations, making sure that there are clear and transparent processes for people to be able to, blow a whistle and to make sure that those things are not corrupted is obviously pretty important. And in the sort of the government sphere, should there be some sort of additional review and check processes, do you think? Or is it just impossible to really try and crack open the cultural norms that are clearly there in more official circles?
Very big question. And I think what's useful is to look at different parts of the world. And Australia has a very secretive government operation. Not that different from a lot of places, but if you look at Sweden, for example, all the government just posts everything online, and the journalist is interested in something, they just ring up and ask more about it. So it's very different. It's not to say that Sweden is free of corruption. It certainly isn't, and it's got its own, powerful complexes and so forth. So if you look at different parts of the world and say, what are they doing well, and then learn from that. But of course, they might be doing the opposite. They're looking at what's going on in China or, in Russia and say, oh, we can do that too.
Yes. And I was just going to sort of steer the conversation finally to one other domain. Do you think the emergence of digital and the so-called transparency that actually creates helps or hinders this whole process?
It's a combination. So in a lot of situations, the existence of social media is wonderful. So if you're living in a dictatorship and you want to organize a rally, you can't have any access to the mass media because that's all controlled by the government. So a lot of experiences with digital media, you might say network media, social media is actually of crucial importance in freedom struggles. But on the other hand, it also can give the government amazing surveillance powers, and that's a big danger. And so we see in Australia, we talk to whistleblowers. In the old days, they couldn't possibly get their story out. The best they could do is maybe produce a leaflet and hand it around or something like that. Yeah. But now that you can set up your own website, and a lot of people do. They set up the website, get all this information, all the documents. They can do that in a way they couldn't before. But on the other hand, if you want to get media coverage of your story, the last thing you want to do is ring up a journalist, because immediately your phone number, that call is registered in the metadata retention. The journalist does a story, they just look through all the context, and then you're exposed. So it's like the government saying, we got whistleblower protection, wonderful, but we're going to have all this data protection, all this, the surveillance capacities, and also criminalize certain sorts of whistleblowing and journalism. So you look at what they do, not that what they say is the protection.
Yes, and of course we've had cases recently where journalists have been essentially, accused of, and there are cases pending at the moment where you've expected really if journalism was about free speech and openness and transparency, there should be no issues, and yet these are issues that are actually in front of the courts or potentially in the front of the courts. So it shows that those powers have taken us in a rather unfortunate direction and actually limits potentially freedom of media.
I think the thing that's really amazing about this is the government's overreached in its attacks on journalists, and it's made the different media come together in a way they haven't before. So once again, what I think is useful about looking at tactics, looking at the methods that are used by powerful groups, but also by challengers, and learn from that how to be effective.
Right. And, to my mind, what you're really coming back to below all of this is what I call the machinery of control, right? There are a set of rules and processes that actually exist, which are not overt, but which actually need to be understood to be able to understand how things are and how things actually work.
Yes, I agree with that. And the funny thing is, a lot of whistleblowers are the people who don't understand what's going on underneath. They actually believe the rhetoric of the organization, that we're doing things right. And the whistleblowers are often highly conscientious people. They rise up in the system, and then they have no reason, not to believe the system is doing the right thing. And then when they see there's something wrong, they just assume, I'll report it because the system works. Whereas you've got the cynical people who know that the system's corrupt and that they're just going to go along with it or fight it, in a sort of covert way. They're not whistleblowers. And you might say they're more likely to be activists, or if they're too cynical, they just sort of not care, which is even more unfortunate.
Well, you paint a very intriguing and concerning picture, Brian, and I do thank you for your time today. We'll put links to the book below, which is available for download actually online, and I do recommend a read. It is a very, very thought-provoking book, and I do thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Great. Did I cover anything that you would want to be asked about that I didn't ask?
No, it's all fine.
Great. Okay. Well, I really appreciate that. I really enjoyed that, and as I say, I thought it was a really, really, interesting read, and the points you make just are very, very well made. So thank you. I do appreciate your time today.
Just give you a comment on